do with this is a couple of things. This is definitely a tutorial based on curves, but I do want to show you my settings that I use every time I open up an image, and I always use Adobe Camera Raw. I don't use Lightroom, although I do understand that Lightroom is just a more robust version of Adobe Camera Raw, okay? So I'm just going to show you what I typically do. So if you look, when you try to open your raw image and it opens it up with Adobe Camera Raw, you're going to click down here, and when you click on there, anywhere, doesn't matter, all of these options here are going to come up. So I always work in Adobe RGB 1998 when I'm editing. I want to take advantage of the most colors that I can have possibly at my fingertips. I work in a 16-bit depth, and the reason for that is because I do a lot of different adjustments and contrasts and all kinds of gradients and things like that, which will create banding in 8-bit images. So I just make it a habit to use 16-bit, and since I've started doing that, I do notice that my images do have a much nicer quality. And yes, you do have to convert your images to JPEG once you're completely finished editing in order to save it as a JPEG. As well, my resolution's 300, and that's about it. So I do want to make sure that I open in Photoshop as a smart object, and the reason for that is I do want the ability to come back into Adobe Camera Raw and mask on or off other adjustments that I might make at that time as well. So when you're in Adobe Camera Raw, obviously the few things that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to adjust your whites and your highlights and your shadows possibly. A lot of times we're not going to get the image exactly perfect straight out of the camera if you're working in natural light. For instance, this here, we're working in natural light. We didn't have reflectors or anything. So I would come in here and I would probably bump up my shadows a little bit just to bring a little bit more light into her. And I don't usually touch contrast at all. I will adjust my clarity, and you can see that clarity does do a similar job as contrast. However, keep in mind that clarity doesn't add the dreaded red tinges that contrast will, but you have to also take into consideration that with clarity, it will definitely show a little bit more of skin texture. So if you're working on an image where perhaps your subject has less than desirable skin, you might want to take it easy on your clarity slider. And then of course in here you can adjust your temperature, you can toggle back and forth and just find a place that you like. You may already have it perfect straight out of the camera the way you want it. As far as tint goes, you come in here, you can add a little bit more green or pink, whichever you like. Now these are the basic changes that I will make in Adobe Camera Raw as I'm opening up. It does get a lot more in depth, and I will have additional tutorials on Adobe Camera Raw, but I just wanted to show you my basic settings straight out of the gate. Now I would click Open Object, okay? So once I open my object, I may or may not want to go back and do some additional tweaking in Adobe Camera Raw. So for that reason, that's why I'm opening this as a smart object. But for this tutorial, since it's curves, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to flatten this image, and I'm just going to let you see what I do next if I was working strictly in a curves environment. All right, so the power of curves. First of all, let's just talk about what curves is. So curves gives you pretty much an insurmountable playing field as far as what you might want to do with colors, with midtones, with darks, with highlights, all of that stuff. It really is one of the more powerful adjustment layers that you can play with in Photoshop. So let's just take a look and see what we can do with curves. So this is the RGB layer. All right, so RGB is red, green, and blue. All of them all together. Sort of like if you go into your hue saturation adjustment, you're going to see the one setting that is the master. This is sort of the same thing. So it's mostly going to adjust not the colors as much as it's going to adjust just your highlights, your darks, and your midtones. So if you pull this down in the middle, then basically what you're doing is you're pulling deep all of the midtones. If you pull it straight up, it's the same thing. You're pulling up your midtones. So if you come down to the left here, these are your darks, the darkest of darks. So if you pull it right this way, your blacks are going to get clipped. If you pull it up this way, it's adding almost that, you know, that matte color to your blacks, okay? And then same thing here with your highlights. If you pull this to the left, it's really going to pop out your highlights. And if you pull it down, it's going to mute them a bit, okay? So one of the first adjustments that I typically will do in curves is I will do a contrast S-curve adjustment, okay? And so what that means is I look for the first square in my grid, pull it down just a tiny bit here, and my last square, and I pull it up just a tiny bit here, okay? And now if you come back to your layers palette and you click that on and off, you can see that that's added quite the contrast, and it's also added that reddish hue that it usually will do every time you do something in the RGB layer, okay? So with this, you can decide to reduce the opacity so that it gives you a little bit more control, and that way you're just adding the slightest amount of contrast, okay? We're going to delete that. I think what we're going to work on first is we're going to take a look at just adjusting the light on her, because behind her is relatively bright, so we want to sort of work on that. I mean, some people might leave it as is and just edit it this way and do their retouching. Other people will reverse it, but this is strictly a tutorial on curves, so I'm going to show you a couple of things that you can do. So for the first step, we're just going to look at adjusting that background, okay? Now let's, for instance, assume that we want to maybe mute the background a little bit. So you can look here that if I wanted to make it more like a matte, less bright, we want to make sure that the window light coming out is maybe a little darker, something like that. And up in here, if you pull this up, it makes it brighter again, but if you pull this down, it's going to darken it down a bit as well. Okay, so you can look at her and go, oh, she looks absolutely horrible, which she does. But remember that with all your adjustment layers and your curves, you're working on a mask. So as long as you choose your black brush here and make sure that, I work in 100% opacity at all times, and I only use my flow. So my flow, I'm going to work it around 12%, keep it really low, and come back in here, and I'm just going to mask that effect off of her. And all that I'm doing with that basic curves adjustment is I've taken the highlights away from the background. I've made the highlights in the background look a little softer, a little less harsh, and this is going to probably increase the focus on her and bring your eye to her more directly, okay? And then from here, after we brush this off of her, we can again, and again, I'm not doing any retouching in this image. We're strictly going to make effects to this image using curves adjustments for this tutorial. So if we come in here and we just make sure that all of that is off of her skin. You're going to have to adjust the size of your brush as you go. You can always look at your mask over here, and you can determine by the size of it if you've managed to get everything off of your subject. Once you think you've gotten most of it off, you can bump that up to 100% and then just go over it one more time. You don't have to go right to the edge because you don't want the feathering to affect the background. And then take a look at your before and your after. So do you see what that's done? And you can see that I still have some here that I need to remove. So really work with turning it on and turning it off like this, and that'll really assist you in that department. Okay, and if you want to, I would suggest grabbing a harder brush, one that has less spray, so that when you come to the edge like this, you can make sure that you painted it directly off of her skin and it's not going to spray onto the background. Because when you use that soft brush, it's kind of like a spray paint, right? So it'll overspray. And when you're masking on or off effects like this, you kind of want a hard, firm line that will give you that definite line to take that effect off of your subject or paint it on, whatever which way it is that you're working. But for me, I usually will do this. I'll come back and I will make sure that that effect is right to the edge and that it's clean and there's there's no residue left behind from using a soft spray-like brush, okay? And then once you do that, you can go to the properties of your mask, which is here, and feather that out, and that way if there's any harsh lines left, then that will get rid of those hard lines. So we're just gonna show you what that has done here, okay? And now that we've masked that, we're gonna double click on this little icon right here again. That's gonna bring our curves back up, and this time we're gonna come into our blue channel. And now that we've masked it off, all of the effects that we do on this image are only going to affect the part that we painted on with the mask. So we do know in this that if you pull the blue line down at any point, it's gonna apply a yellow color to it, yes? And this is another way that you can really look at your masking and see what parts of your image you still need to paint on or off, okay? But the nice thing about this, if you come right up here, and these are only going to affect your highlights. Do you see that? So you pull that down just a little bit, and now you've added some kind of warm, maybe afternoon looking sun to this. And if you pull this one down too, you're adding a little bit more yellow. And then if you come down here to the bottom and you pull it up a little bit, what this does is this adds a little bit of blue toning to the shadows, which can be super, super cool at times, okay? And you can always come back if you think it's too yellow. You can pull this up and it's going to add more blue as well. This one here, you can pull it up as well. If you come the other way, see all the blue you're adding in? So just remember that the blue channel in curves is blue or yellow. Those are the two colors that you get with this. And so you can really play with those and add some dimension to the background of your image, all right? But for this, we're going to come back here again, and I just saw that we had, once we played with the colors in that curves layer, that we had still some leftover remnants of that mask. So we're just going to come in and paint that off really quickly, just so that everything is the way that it should be. Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to come down here, we're going to do another curves adjustment. This time we're going to focus solely on her and her face. So we do know that her face is darker. There's a clipping here of darkness in her hair, and her skin here is rather dark. So I'm going to focus on the darker areas of the image, and I'm just going to start pulling this up just a little bit in the first square, just to see what I can do as far as maybe getting some of those darker areas in her face and on the skin just a little bit less dark. And that looks pretty good. So you see, all I've done is I've added points which will increase the brightness or lightness in the darker areas of this image. So don't be afraid to play with it. And just remember that the last dot that you put or point in your graph here has to be higher than the one before it, otherwise you get this muddy look. See the muddiness to it? So make sure that it's always just a little bit higher, and you'll have more of a pretty contrast, clearer looking image. So now what we want to do with this, because we don't want this effect on the background, what we just fixed here is we're going to hit Command I, and that's going to invert it back, right? So now just make sure that you grab your white brush, because your mask is black. So in order to apply that, you have to make sure that you have your white selected. And once again, I'm using a hard brush right now, just because I want my edges to be pretty sharp. And I'll show you what I'll do after. But this is a great technique that you can use in, any type of a portrait environment that you need to maybe do some lighting repairs on, or skin issues, that type of thing. It works very well. So now I'm just going to grab my soft brush and reduce my flow down to around 3%. And I'm just going to very lightly go around my edges like this, just to get off some of that dark I am going to feather my mask out. Which will get rid of some of this. Watch. So you feather it out like that, and you can see the before and the after. So do you see what I'm saying as far as this is concerned? So now what we've done is, if you take a look at this image, so we've reversed it, right? So typically, if you're shooting a subject, and even though this one is lit from both sides, it's still going to result in some shadowing on your subject. So what I've done is I've added a little bit of drama, some yellowing, tinting in the curves, deepened down the background, masked it off of her, and then turned around and added some light onto her. And keep in mind, you can always adjust your opacity of your levels afterwards as well, okay? So that you can decide whether or not 100% opacity works or doesn't work. So what I encourage you to do too is come back to your background layer, duplicate your background layer, blend all of these together, so merge them together. So now you're left with 2 image files in your layers. See this? So this is before and that's after. And then that way, if you need to, you can add a layer mask to this and you can paint some on or off again. But what we're going to show you now is I'm going to show you another curves adjustment. And now if we add our contrast like we were talking about before, which is coming up to your last square here and then pulling this one down a little bit. You can really go heavy or not. So now let's just look at the before. So we've added a little bit of contrast to this image. And what you can do with this as well is Command I to invert it, and then you can paint that, maybe bump your flow up to around 20, and then lightly with the light brush, you can just paint on a little bit of contrast just onto her. And then that way it's not affecting the background if you want to keep that, you know, kind of buttery look to your background and just have her a little bit more contrasty or a little sharp appearing. Okay? So keep in mind that this is the same thing that I can do on any image whatsoever. So you see we've added just a little bit of pop of light to her. I'm going to merge these two together. And here's the before and here's the after. And that's with some very simple, easy to use curves adjustments. Don't be afraid to come in and grab another one and come into your reds and do the same thing. So what I suggest you do is, you know, play with your highlights. Just remember your highlights are in the upper and your shadows and your lower colors are in the lower. So here I'm pulling it down into the shadows more of a green, because in the red curves, if you pull down it's green, if you pull up it's red. So for this one, if I pull this down as well, what we're going to do is we're going to turn the whole image a little bit cyan or more green, right? So you pull this down, and remember, if you go to the very bottom of any of your curves and pull it up, you're going to add a little bit of drama, and this is your shadow. So if you look into her hair, do you see how it's turning it red? Exactly. So if you wanted to do that, you could do that as well. You want to bring this back to normal, you can just drag up your points and you're back to where you started. The same thing with your green. So in your green, if you pull up, it's really green. If you pull down, it's really red, almost fuchsia. This is like a really magenta. This is a really green. And it's pretty much the same as in selective color or anything. It's just using the 2 contrasting colors in every single layer. So you could pull, let's say, your shadows. You could add a little bit of magenta into your shadows with this. And then you could also pull a little bit of green up. And then you can come over here and take a look and see what that's done. So it's just added that little bit of something else. And I actually like that. I think it's pretty cool, but it's a little strong. So I'm going to pull it back to about 50%. Okay. And we're just going to turn these 2 off and take a look at the before and the after. And this image has 0 retouching, right? All we've done is curves. So this is been a curves adjustment tutorial. I hope that you enjoyed it and that you learned something new. Thanks. Have a great day, guys.